Right now, in this exact second, there is a version of you that speaks English fluently. Not someday, not after another course, another app, another year of study. Right now, that version of you is sitting inside your own skull, fully formed, fully fluent, and almost completely locked away from the version of you that opens their mouth and feels nothing but static. Read that again, because it is not a metaphor and it is not motivational fluff. It is a simple, testable, almost embarrassing fact about how your mind works. You already understand thousands of English words. You already know the grammar. You already know how sentences are supposed to sound, because you have heard correct English thousands upon thousands of times in movies, in songs, in conversations, in books, in classrooms. Somewhere between your ears, all of that is sitting in storage, organized, connected, ready to be used. And yet, the moment someone looks at you and asks a simple question in English, something strange happens. The words do not come. Your mind goes quiet, or worse, it goes loud with panic, with translation, with 100 half-formed sentences that never make it out of your mouth. You freeze. You mumble. You say, "How do you say?" in your own language. Because in that moment, the vault is locked, and you cannot remember the combination. This is the strangest and most misunderstood problem in language learning. It is not a knowledge problem. It is an access problem, and once you understand the difference, everything about how you learn to speak English changes. Here is a question I want you to sit with for a moment. Have you ever been watching a movie in English, no subtitles, and understood almost everything? Have you ever read an English article, a text message, a caption on a video, and understood it instantly without translating word by word? Have you ever listened to someone speak fast, casual English, and caught the meaning even though you could never have produced that sentence yourself? If the answer is yes, and for almost everyone reading this the answer is yes, then you already have proof. Proof that the knowledge is there. Proof that your brain has built a working, functioning model of English somewhere deep inside itself. The problem was never that you do not know enough. The problem is that you have never been taught how to open the door between what you understand and what you can say. This channel is called The Speaking Reset, and that name is not an accident. We are not here to teach you more grammar rules. We are not here to hand you another list of vocabulary words to memorize and forget. We are here to reset the relationship between your brain and your mouth, so that the English you already possess can finally come out of you the way it is supposed to. In the next several chapters, I am going to walk you through exactly what is happening inside your mind when you struggle to speak, even though you understand so much. I am going to show you why years of studying grammar rules and memorizing vocabulary lists made you better at reading and worse at speaking. I am going to show you the exact reflex your brain uses to protect you from embarrassment, and how that same reflex is the thing standing between you and fluency. And I am going to give you a practical, specific, almost shockingly simple method to start converting your passive English, the English you understand, into active English, the English you can produce on command, starting today. This is not going to be another video that makes you feel motivated for 10 minutes and then leaves you exactly where you started. This is going to be the video where something clicks, where you finally understand why your English has felt stuck and exactly what to do to unstick it. I know that if you have felt this gap for years, it can be tempting to explain it away with stories that feel true but are not actually accurate. Maybe you have told yourself that some people are simply born with a talent for languages and you are not one of them. Maybe you have told yourself that you started learning too late, or that your memory is not good enough, or that speaking under pressure is a skill some people have and others simply lack. I want to gently push back on all of these stories, not because I am trying to sell you false comfort, but because none of them match what is actually happening inside your mind, and believing them keeps you stuck in exactly the kind of passive, input-only learning that created this gap in the first place. So here is what I want you to do. Stop thinking of yourself as someone who does not know English well. Start thinking of yourself as someone who knows English, but has not yet learned how to retrieve it under pressure. That single shift in identity is going to matter more than you think, because everything after this point is about training retrieval, not building more knowledge. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Hidden Vault Inside Your Mind. Let me tell you about a woman I will call Amara, because her story is the story of almost every English learner I have ever met, in one form or another. Amara studied English for 11 years. She passed every exam, She could read a scientific article in English faster than most native speakers could read it in their own language. She could write long, correct, complex emails without a single grammar mistake. Her vocabulary was enormous. She had learned words that even university-educated native speakers had never heard. And then one day, a man sat down next to her on a plane and asked her, in plain, simple English, "So what do you do for a living?" And Amara froze. Not because she did not understand the question. She understood it instantly, effortlessly, the way you understand your own name. She froze because the moment she tried to answer, her mind went completely blank. Words that she had read 1,000 times simply refused to arrive. She stammered. She said a broken half-sentence. She apologized for her English, this woman who had scored near perfect on international exams, this woman who had read entire novels in English for pleasure. If this story sounds familiar, if some version of this has happened to you, I want you to understand something important. What happened to Amara was not a failure of knowledge, it was a failure of access. And the difference between those two things is the entire subject of this video. Inside your mind, there are two very different kinds of English. The first is called receptive knowledge, sometimes called passive knowledge. This is everything you can understand when you hear it or read it, but cannot necessarily produce on your own. The second is called productive knowledge, or active knowledge. This is everything you can generate yourself, on demand, under pressure, in real time, without anyone feeding you the words first. For almost every single person who has studied a foreign language through school, through apps, through years of reading and watching and listening, the receptive vault is enormous, and the productive vault is small. This is not a personal failure. It is the completely predictable result of how most people are taught languages. Think about how you actually learned English. You read textbooks, you listened to audio, you watched movies and television shows, you scrolled through English content online. Every single one of these activities trains receptive knowledge. Every single one of these activities strengthens your ability to recognize and understand English. None of these activities, on their own, trains your mouth, your vocal cords, your breath, and your real-time word retrieval system to actually produce spoken English under the pressure of a live conversation. This is why so many advanced English learners can read academic papers but cannot order food confidently. This is why so many people can write beautiful essays but cannot answer a simple question at a job interview without their mind going blank. It is not a contradiction. It is exactly what you would expect from years of receptive training and almost no productive training. Here is a way to think about it that might make this click into place. Imagine you spent 10 years watching professional football on television. You watched thousands of hours of matches. You could describe every strategy, every formation, every famous player's technique, in incredible detail. You understood the game better than most people who actually played it. Now imagine someone hands you a ball and says, "Go play in a real match, right now, against real opponents, under real pressure." Would your years of watching translate directly into smooth, confident, physical performance on the field? Of course not. Watching football and playing football use overlapping but fundamentally different skills. Watching builds your understanding of the game. Playing builds your body's ability to execute under pressure, in real time, without time to think. Speaking a language is exactly the same. Understanding English, reading English, recognizing English, these are the equivalent of watching the match from the stands. Speaking English in real time, generating your own sentences, retrieving the right word in half a second while someone is looking at you and waiting for your answer, this is the equivalent of actually being on the field. You can watch 1,000 matches and still stumble the first time you are asked to play. That is not weakness. That is simply what happens when one skill has been trained for years and the other skill has barely been touched. Now here is the part that should genuinely excite you. Because once you understand this, you understand why the fix is so much closer than you think. The vocabulary is already there. The grammar patterns are already there. The sentence structures are already there. You are not starting from zero. You are not an English beginner pretending to be intermediate. You are, in a very real sense, sitting on top of an enormous vault of English that you built over years of exposure, and what has been missing is not more material to put into the vault. What has been missing is a key. Let's talk about what that key actually is, because this is where most English learning advice completely misses the point. Most people, when they realize they cannot speak as well as they can understand, respond by doing more of the same thing that got them here. They watch more movies. They read more books. They study more grammar. they add more words to a vocabulary list, and their receptive knowledge grows even larger, while their productive gap stays exactly the same size, or sometimes gets even wider, because now there is even more knowledge locked in the vault with no new way to access it. This is like our football fan deciding that since they cannot play well, they should watch even more matches. More hours of television will never build the muscle memory, the reflexes, and the real-time decision-making that only come from actually stepping onto the field, making mistakes, adjusting, and trying again. The key that opens the vault is not more input, it is retrieval practice under conditions that resemble real speaking. It is the repeated act of reaching into your mind under a small amount of pressure and pulling out a word, a phrase, a sentence, using your own voice, out loud, in real time, without someone else supplying the answer for you. This single distinction, input versus retrieval, receptive versus productive, watching versus playing, is going to be the foundation for everything else in this video. Every chapter after this one builds directly on top of this idea. So before we move forward, I want you to actually accept this idea, not just intellectually understand it, but feel it. Because the moment you stop believing that you have a knowledge problem and start believing that you have a retrieval problem, your entire approach to practicing English changes. You stop asking yourself, what more do I need to learn? You start asking yourself, how can I practice pulling out what I already have, more often, under slightly more realistic conditions, until it becomes automatic? Consider for a moment how a small child learns their first language. A toddler does not sit down with a vocabulary list. A toddler does not study grammar charts. A toddler is surrounded by language, yes, but the true magic of first language acquisition happens through an enormous, almost uncomfortable amount of attempted production. Toddlers talk constantly. They mislabel things. They make grammar mistakes at an astonishing rate. They say sentences that are completely wrong, and adults around them respond, correct gently, and keep the conversation flowing. The child is not silently absorbing forever. The child is retrieving, constantly, badly, and then better again. Now compare that to how most adults learn a second language. Years of quiet, passive absorption. Reading silently, listening silently, watching silently, occasionally speaking a rehearsed sentence in a classroom, then going back to years more of silent absorption. The ratio of input to output is wildly lopsided compared to how children naturally acquire language. And the result of that lopsided ratio is exactly the pattern you have probably experienced yourself. Enormous comprehension, fragile, hesitant, effortful production. I want to be very clear about something, because this point matters. This is not your fault. If you learned English mostly through school, through apps, through media, this input-heavy, output-light pattern is almost universal. It is built into how modern language education works, into how most apps are designed, into how most people naturally assume language learning should happen. You were never taught that speaking requires its own distinct kind of practice. You were led to believe that if you simply understood enough, speaking would eventually just happen on its own. For a small number of people, in very specific circumstances, usually involving being forced to speak constantly out of necessity, that eventually does happen. But for most people, especially adults learning in a classroom or through self-study, comprehension can grow for years while production stays stuck, unless something specifically targets that gap. That something is what the rest of this video and this entire channel is built around. Before we move into the next chapter, I want to leave you with one image to hold on to. Somewhere inside your mind, right now, there is a room full of English. Thousands of words, hundreds of grammar patterns, countless phrases you have absorbed from years of listening and reading. The lights in that room are on. The furniture is arranged. Everything is there, ready. The only thing missing is a well-worn path from that room to your mouth. Not a new room, not more furniture, a path. And paths are built the same way in every domain of human skill, through repeated use, through walking the same route again and again until it becomes smooth, familiar, and fast. Let me give you a few more everyday examples of this same pattern, because the more clearly you can recognize it in your own life, the more powerful this entire framework becomes for you personally. Think about song lyrics. Many English learners can sing along to English songs, sometimes songs they have heard hundreds of times, catching every word, feeling the rhythm, understanding the meaning behind the lines, without ever having consciously memorized the lyrics the way you might memorize a vocabulary list. That knowledge arrived through repeated exposure, and it sits in your mind as genuine, working English. And yet, ask that same person to spontaneously produce an original sentence using one of the more advanced words from that song, without the song playing, without the rhythm to lean on, and the fluency often disappears. The knowledge exists. The retrieval pathway for spontaneous, unsupported production does not yet exist to the same degree. Think about workplace English. Many professionals who use English daily for reading reports, reading emails, and reading documentation describe feeling like a completely different person the moment they are asked to present ideas out loud in a meeting or negotiate a point verbally with a colleague. The vocabulary required for these situations is often vocabulary they have read 1,000 times in written form. The gap is not vocabulary. The gap is the specific muscle of producing that vocabulary out loud, under the mild social pressure of being heard and evaluated by colleagues in real time. Think about traveling. Many English learners describe understanding almost everything a hotel receptionist, a taxi driver, or a waiter says to them in English, following directions, understanding menus, understanding instructions, while still feeling a small jolt of panic the moment they need to ask a simple follow-up question themselves. Again, this is not a vocabulary gap. It is the same access gap we have been describing. Comprehension flowing easily, production requiring a kind of effort that comprehension never asked for. I want you to take a moment, right now, and think of one specific example from your own life where you understood something in English far more easily than you could have produced it yourself. It might be a phrase from a show. It might be something you read in an article. It might be a sentence a friend or colleague once said to you that you understood instantly, but could never have constructed on your own in that moment. Hold that specific example in your mind, because it is proof, personal, undeniable proof, that the raw material for fluent English already exists inside you. This proof matters enormously, because so much of the discouragement that English learners feel comes from a mistaken belief that they simply do not know enough yet, that fluency is still somewhere far away, still waiting to be earned through years of additional study. That belief, while understandable, is simply not accurate for the vast majority of people who have consumed years of English media, read years of English text, and absorbed years of English conversation around them. The knowledge is not far away, it is already here. What has been missing is specifically the skill of pulling it out under pressure, and that skill, unlike raw vocabulary acquisition, can often be built far more quickly than most people expect, precisely because you are not building something from nothing. You are building a faster, more reliable path to something that already exists. And that path-building process is exactly what the rest of this video is designed to guide you through. This reframing matters more than it might seem at first. The story you tell yourself about why speaking feels hard directly shapes whether you keep avoiding it or start deliberately practicing the missing piece. A story that says, "I simply do not know enough English," leads naturally toward more studying, more reading, more listening, the exact activities that already built the large vault you are sitting on. A story that says, "I know the English, but have not yet trained the specific skill of pulling it out under pressure," leads naturally toward a completely different, far more targeted kind of practice. The kind we are about to spend the rest of this video building together. In the next chapter, we are going to look at exactly why that path has stayed unused for so long, and we are going to meet the specific mental reflex that has been quietly protecting you from speaking, while convincing you the whole time that it was protecting you from something else entirely. Chapter 2. The freeze reflex. There is a moment that almost every English learner knows intimately, even if they have never had words for it before. It is the moment right before you speak, when your mind suddenly goes white, like a screen flickering off. Someone asks you a question. You understood every single word of it, and then, instead of an answer flowing out of you, there is a gap, a silence, a strange kind of static, where your thoughts should be. Most people describe this moment as forgetting. They say, "I forgot how to say it. I forgot the word. My mind went blank." But what is actually happening in that moment is not forgetting at all. It is something closer to an emergency shutdown. And understanding why your brain does this is one of the most liberating things you can learn as a language learner. Your brain is, above almost everything else, a prediction and protection machine. Its oldest and most powerful job, older than language, older than logic, is keeping you safe from threat. For most of human history, threat meant physical danger, a predator, a fall, an attack. But your brain does not only respond to physical danger, it responds just as intensely to social danger. And for most adults, almost nothing feels more socially dangerous than the possibility of publicly failing, publicly embarrassing yourself, publicly being seen as less capable in front of other people. Speaking a language you are not fully confident in front of another person, especially a native speaker, especially in a professional or social setting where you want to be respected, is registered by many brains as exactly this kind of danger. Not physical danger, but the deeply uncomfortable danger of public failure, judgment, and loss of status. When your brain detects this kind of threat, it does something that made complete sense for our ancestors and makes very little sense in a modern conversation. It activates a stress response. Your amygdala, the small almond-shaped structure deep in your brain responsible for detecting threat and triggering fear, fires rapidly. Stress hormones are released. Your body prepares for danger. And here is the crucial part. The part of your brain most responsible for complex language production, working memory, and flexible thinking, the prefrontal cortex, is extremely sensitive to this stress response. Under high stress, the prefrontal cortex becomes less efficient. Access to stored information becomes slower and less reliable. This is not a metaphor. This is a well-documented pattern in how stress affects cognitive performance. Under acute stress, retrieval of information you absolutely do know becomes harder. Not because the information disappeared, but because the stress response temporarily narrows and slows the very system responsible for pulling that information out and organizing it into fluent speech. This is why you can know a word perfectly well in a calm, private moment, effortlessly recall it while writing an email or talking to yourself in the shower, and then completely lose access to that same word the instant a real person is looking at you, waiting for an answer, in real time. The knowledge did not vanish. The retrieval system got hijacked by a threat response that was never actually necessary in the first place. I want you to notice something important here, because it changes how you should think about your own struggles. This freeze reflex is not a sign that your English is bad. It is not a sign that you are a slow learner, or that you lack talent, or that some people are simply born better at languages than you. This reflex exists in people with advanced vocabularies and near-perfect grammar just as often as it exists in true beginners, sometimes even more, because the more a person cares about being seen as competent, the more their brain treats a stumble as a serious social threat. Think back to Amara from the previous chapter, the woman with 11 years of English study who froze on an airplane. Her problem was never insufficient knowledge. Her problem, in that specific moment, was an activated threat response that temporarily reduced her access to knowledge she absolutely possessed. The stranger's simple question triggered, somewhere deep in her nervous system, a familiar and ancient signal: you are being evaluated, you might fail, you might be embarrassed, and that signal, faster than conscious thought, narrowed her access to fluent retrieval. I want to describe the physical experience of this reflex in a bit more detail, because many learners feel genuinely relieved simply to hear their own physical sensations named and explained clearly, rather than experienced as a confusing, unnamed sense of malfunction. When the freeze reflex activates, many people notice a subtle tightening in the chest or throat, a slight increase in heart rate, a warmth or flush in the face, and a kind of narrowing of attention, where it becomes harder to notice anything other than the immediate pressure of the moment. Breathing often becomes shallower and faster, which itself further amplifies the physical stress response, creating a kind of feedback loop between the physical sensations and the cognitive narrowing that makes word retrieval feel so much harder in that moment. Thoughts that felt clear and available just moments before, perhaps while silently rehearsing an answer, suddenly feel scattered, distant, or entirely inaccessible the instant real-time pressure appears. Recognizing these physical sensations as a known, well-understood pattern, rather than a mysterious personal failing, is itself a useful first step, because it allows you to respond to the sensations differently in the moment. One simple, evidence-based technique that can help in the middle of this reflex is a brief, deliberate slowing of your breath, specifically extending the exhale slightly longer than the inhale, which has a well-documented calming effect on the nervous system's stress response. This does not eliminate the freeze reflex instantly or permanently, and it is not a substitute for the longer-term graduated exposure work we are discussing throughout this chapter, but it can provide a small amount of immediate relief in a difficult moment, enough, in many cases, to allow at least partial access back to your stored knowledge, rather than complete shutdown. Once you understand that this reflex is the real obstacle and not some deficiency in your vocabulary, an important question follows. How do you calm a threat response that operates faster than conscious reasoning, faster than willpower, faster than telling yourself to relax? The answer is not to try harder to be calm in the moment. Willpower is almost useless against a fast-acting stress response, because by the time you consciously notice you are panicking, the reflex has already begun. The real answer is exposure. Not exposure in the passive sense of watching more English content, but exposure in the specific sense of practicing speech production under mild, controlled, repeated pressure, so that your nervous system gradually reclassifies speaking English as safe rather than threatening. This is precisely how exposure-based approaches work for every kind of fear response, not just language anxiety. A person afraid of public speaking does not overcome that fear by reading books about public speaking, no matter how many books they read. They overcome it by speaking publicly, in small, manageable doses, repeatedly, until their nervous system updates its prediction from danger to safe. The nervous system does not update through information. It updates through repeated, survived experience. This is why simply knowing more vocabulary, simply understanding more grammar, does almost nothing to reduce the freeze reflex. The freeze reflex is not a knowledge gap. It is a safety prediction, and safety predictions only change through repeated exposure to the situation in question, at a manageable intensity, enough times that the brain updates its model of what is dangerous and what is not. Here is something that will probably resonate if you have struggled with speaking anxiety. Have you noticed that your English often flows more easily when you are talking to yourself, alone, in your room, rehearsing a conversation in your head or even out loud? Have you noticed that texting in English, where you have time to think, feels far easier than speaking in real time? This is not a coincidence, and it is not because texting somehow uses different English knowledge than speaking does. It is because the threat response, the one that specifically activates around real-time social evaluation, is far less active when you are alone, or when you have time to think without someone watching you in real time. I also want to mention something about how this reflex tends to change once you begin actively working with it, rather than simply enduring it passively. Many people assume that the freeze reflex either exists fully or is completely gone, as though confidence were a switch rather than a gradual, continuous process. In reality, most learners experience this reflex fading in a graduated, uneven way, sometimes appearing strongly in a new or unusually high-stakes situation even after months of solid progress, and sometimes barely appearing at all in a situation that used to feel deeply threatening. This unevenness is completely normal and does not indicate that your progress has reversed. It simply reflects the fact that your nervous system evaluates each new situation somewhat independently, based on how closely it resembles situations you have already successfully practiced and survived. This gives us an extremely useful insight for how to practice. The goal is not to avoid the discomfort of real-time speaking forever and stick only to comfortable, low-pressure practice like reading and listening. Comfortable practice alone will never train your nervous system to tolerate the specific pressure of live conversation. But throwing yourself directly into high-stakes conversations, like job interviews or important meetings, before you have built any tolerance, often backfires badly, reinforcing the very fear response you are trying to reduce, because a bad experience under high stress teaches your brain that yes, this really is dangerous. The smarter path, the path we are going to build out in detail in later chapters, is graduated exposure. Practicing real-time spoken production, out loud, using your actual voice, under conditions of mild, manageable, gradually increasing pressure, until the specific act of retrieving English under time pressure feels normal, familiar, and safe to your nervous system. Before we move forward, I want to address something you might be thinking right now, because I have heard some version of this from almost everyone who has gone through this realization. You might be thinking, this makes sense, but how do I actually create these graduated, low-pressure speaking opportunities in my daily life? Not everyone has a patient native-speaking friend willing to have slow, forgiving conversations every single day. Not everyone has time or money for regular conversation classes. This concern is completely valid, and we are going to address it directly and practically in the chapters ahead. For now, I want you to simply absorb this one core truth, because it is going to change how you interpret every awkward, frozen, embarrassing speaking moment you have ever had or will ever have again. You did not freeze because you are bad at English. You froze because an ancient, well-intentioned but badly calibrated part of your brain mistook a conversation for a threat and temporarily narrowed your access to knowledge that was, the entire time, sitting safely inside you. The moment you stop interpreting these freezes as evidence of failure and start interpreting them as evidence of an overactive protection system that simply needs recalibrating through practice, something shifts. The shame starts to lift. And once the shame lifts even slightly, real practice becomes possible. Because shame is one of the most powerful things that keeps people avoiding the very practice that would help them the most. I want to walk through a few more specific, everyday situations where this freeze reflex tends to appear. Because recognizing its exact triggers in your own life is an important step toward eventually neutralizing them. One extremely common trigger is being asked a direct question by someone you perceive as having higher status, authority, or evaluative power over you. A manager, an interviewer, a teacher, or a native speaker whose opinion of your ability you care about. In these situations, the social stakes feel higher, and the brain, correctly or not, registers a greater potential cost to failure, which intensifies the threat response and narrows retrieval even further. Another extremely common trigger is being asked to speak in front of multiple people at once, rather than one-on-one. Group settings, such as meetings or classroom situations, often feel more threatening than individual conversations because the brain perceives a larger audience as a larger potential source of judgment, even if, in reality, most people in that group are not actually paying close attention or judging you as harshly as your anxiety suggests. A third common trigger is unexpected or unpredictable questions, as opposed to questions you anticipated and mentally prepared for in advance. This is precisely why many English learners can perform reasonably well in situations they rehearsed beforehand, such as a prepared presentation or a practiced introduction, while feeling far more anxious and prone to freezing during spontaneous, unplanned conversation, where the specific content of the exchange cannot be anticipated or rehearsed in advance. Understanding your own specific triggers is valuable because it allows you to design your practice deliberately around them, gradually exposing yourself to slightly more challenging versions of exactly the situations that currently feel most threatening, rather than avoiding them indefinitely, or, at the opposite extreme, throwing yourself into the most difficult version of that trigger before you have built any tolerance at all. I also want to mention something that many people find genuinely reassuring once they hear it clearly stated. The freeze reflex, uncomfortable as it feels in the moment, does not reflect anything permanent about your identity or your true capability. It reflects the current state of your nervous system's calibration around a specific kind of situation, a calibration that was built through past experiences and is entirely capable of being updated through new experiences. Just as a nervous system can learn, sometimes through a single very difficult experience, that a particular situation is highly threatening, a nervous system can also learn, gradually, through repeated, manageable exposure, that the exact same situation is, in fact, safe and survivable. This is not wishful thinking. It is one of the most well-established principles in the entire field of behavioral psychology, and it applies just as reliably to language-related anxiety as it does to any other form of situational anxiety. There is one more important nuance I want to address here, because it often gets overlooked in conversations about language anxiety. The goal of graduated exposure is not to eliminate all discomfort before speaking, and it is not realistic to expect that speaking will feel completely free of any nervousness the moment you begin practicing this way. Even highly fluent, highly confident speakers of a second language sometimes feel a small flicker of nervousness in unfamiliar or high-stakes situations. This is normal and human. The goal is not zero nervousness. The goal is a level of nervousness low enough that it no longer meaningfully interferes with your ability to retrieve and produce the English you already know, rather than a level of nervousness so intense that it hijacks your retrieval system entirely, the way it may have done in the past. There is one more thing worth saying here, because it ties this chapter back to the very first one. The freeze reflex does not erase your knowledge. It only delays and narrows your access to it for a few seconds, sometimes less. This is why, if you give yourself a small amount of space in a conversation, a brief pause, a slower breath, a moment of not rushing to fill the silence immediately, the words you were reaching for very often arrive anyway, just slightly later than you expected. Learning to tolerate that brief gap, rather than panicking the instant it appears, is itself a skill, and it is one that graduated exposure, practiced consistently, builds naturally over time. With that distinction in mind, I want you to start paying closer attention, over the coming days, to the specific situations that trigger your own freeze reflex most strongly. Notice whether it is speaking to authority figures, speaking in groups, or facing unexpected questions that tends to affect you most. This awareness alone will not eliminate the reflex, but it gives you something precise and specific to work with, rather than a vague, undefined sense that speaking English in general feels difficult. In the next chapter, we are going to look at a second, closely related obstacle, one that operates alongside the freeze reflex and often makes it even worse. It is a habit so common among English learners that almost everyone does it without realizing, and it is quietly one of the biggest reasons why speaking feels so much slower and harder than it needs to be. It is called the translation trap, and once you see it clearly, you will start noticing it in almost every hesitant sentence you have ever spoken. Chapter 3. The Translation Trap. I want you to try something with me for a moment, right here, before we go any further. I want you to think of the word for water in your native language. Do not think of the English word yet. Just think of your own word, the one you have used your entire life, the one that feels completely automatic and effortless. Now notice how that word arrived in your mind. It did not arrive after a search. It did not arrive after you consulted some internal dictionary. It simply appeared, instantly, attached directly to the idea of water itself. There was no middle step. The concept of water and the word for water are fused together in your mind, connected by years of direct, repeated use. Now I want you to notice what happens when many English learners try to say the same idea in English. Often, the process is completely different. First, the idea appears in the native language. Then, a search begins, consciously or unconsciously, for the English equivalent. Then, that English word or phrase is retrieved, sometimes easily, sometimes with visible effort, sometimes not at all. Only then does the sentence begin to form, and by that point, an enormous amount of mental processing time has already been used just to produce a single word. This extra step, the step where you form a thought in your native language first and then search for the English translation, is what I call the translation trap. It is one of the most common, most exhausting, and most invisible habits among English learners, and it is a major reason why speaking English feels so much slower and more effortful than understanding it. Here is why this matters so much. Real-time conversation moves fast. A natural conversational rhythm in English involves responses that arrive within a second or two of the previous person finishing their sentence. If every single thought you want to express has to first be fully formed in your native language and then translated word by word or phrase by phrase into English, you are essentially doing two entire cognitive tasks for every single sentence, thinking the thought and then translating the thought, when a fluent speaker is only doing one, thinking directly in the target language. This double workload is exhausting. It explains why so many English learners describe speaking English as tiring in a way that reading or listening never feels tiring. Translation in real time is cognitively expensive. It uses working memory heavily, competes directly with the pressure of the freeze reflex we discussed in the previous chapter, and very often causes exactly the kind of delay that makes conversations feel awkward, that makes native speakers jump in to finish your sentence, that makes you feel like you are always one step behind the conversation instead of inside it. Let me be clear about something important, because this point is often misunderstood. Translation itself is not the enemy. Translation is an extremely useful tool early in language learning, and even experienced translators and interpreters rely on translation skills professionally. The problem is not that translation exists as a skill. The problem is relying on translation as your primary, moment-to-moment strategy for producing spoken language in real-time conversation, because that strategy simply cannot keep pace with the speed that natural conversation requires. Fluent speakers of any language, including native speakers switching between languages, do not typically translate word by word in real time during casual conversation. Instead, over time, through enormous amounts of direct practice, they build what researchers sometimes call direct form-to-meaning connections. This means the English word or phrase becomes directly connected to the concept itself, without a native language detour in between. Exactly the same way your native language words are directly connected to their meanings for you right now. The extremely encouraging news is that this direct connection is not some rare gift reserved for naturally gifted language learners. It is a skill built through repetition, specifically through repeatedly using words and phrases in context, out loud, in situations where you are focused on meaning and communication, rather than on grammatical analysis or translation accuracy. Think about how certain English phrases probably already feel automatic to you. Phrases you use so often that you no longer translate them at all. Words like yes, no, thank you, hello, okay, probably feel instant and automatic in English already, with no translation step whatsoever. This proves that direct form to meaning connections are absolutely possible for you, because you have already built them, just for a small set of extremely frequent words and phrases. The goal is not to acquire some entirely new and mysterious ability. The goal is to expand this same direct connection process to cover a much larger portion of your English vocabulary. So how does this expansion actually happen? This is where many English learners get stuck, because the instinct is often to try to force direct thinking by simply telling yourself, stop translating, think in English. This instruction, while well-meaning, rarely works on its own, because willpower cannot override a deeply automatic habit that has been reinforced over years. Instead, direct form to meaning connections are built the same way almost every automatic skill is built in the brain, through repeated, contextual, meaningful use. There are a few specific practices that are particularly effective at building these direct connections, and I want to walk through them clearly, because they are going to form part of the practical system we build together later in this video. The first is what I call meaning-first exposure. This means encountering new English words and phrases directly connected to images, situations, sounds, or experiences, rather than through a translated word list. For example, learning the phrase pouring rain while actually watching or imagining pouring rain, rather than simply memorizing it as a translated pair alongside its equivalent in your native language. This kind of learning creates a more direct pathway between the English phrase and the concept itself, bypassing the translation step from the very beginning. The second is what I call output before perfection. This means practicing saying sentences using new vocabulary immediately, even imperfectly, even with mistakes, rather than waiting until you feel fully confident with a word before ever attempting to use it. Every time you attempt to produce a word out loud in a real or imagined context, even clumsily, you strengthen the direct connection between that word and the meaning you are trying to express. Every time you delay speaking until you feel ready, you delay the exact practice that would make you ready. The third, and in many ways the most powerful, is what I call repetition in varied contexts. This means using the same word or phrase across many different sentences and situations, rather than practicing it once and moving on. When your brain encounters a word attached to many different specific situations, rather than one single sentence repeated over and over, it builds a richer, more flexible, more directly accessible connection to that word's meaning. This is very different from simply repeating the exact same memorized sentence many times, which tends to create a rigid, narrow memory rather than a flexible, retrievable one. I want to return for a moment to something we touched on in the first chapter, because it connects directly to this idea of translation. Remember the distinction between receptive and productive knowledge. Many English learners have an enormous receptive vocabulary, built through years of reading and listening. But that receptive vocabulary was built primarily through recognition, seeing or hearing a word, and matching it to a meaning you already know, often with a mental translation happening quickly and unconsciously in the background. Recognition and translation-based understanding are very different cognitive processes from direct production, generating that same word yourself, on demand, without the safety net of already seeing it written in front of you. This is exactly why so many people can read an English word instantly and understand its meaning, translating it effortlessly and almost invisibly in their mind, while struggling enormously to produce that exact same word from memory during a live conversation. Reading comprehension relies on recognition, matching an external, already present word to a meaning you hold. Speaking relies on retrieval and production, generating that word from nothing, from an internal need to express a specific meaning, without any external prompt to recognize. There is also a helpful practical implication here that directly applies to how you should choose vocabulary for targeted practice going forward. Because building direct, translation-free connections requires repeated, varied, effortful retrieval practice for each individual word, It is far more efficient to focus this kind of intensive practice on high-frequency words, the words that appear constantly across a huge range of everyday conversations, rather than spreading your limited practice time thinly across rare, specialized vocabulary you might only need occasionally. A relatively small set of the most frequently used words and phrases in spoken English accounts for the overwhelming majority of actual conversational speech, which means that building strong, automatic, direct retrieval for this core set of frequent words produces a disproportionately large improvement in your overall conversational fluency, compared to spending equivalent practice time on rarer, more specialized vocabulary. This is one of the clearest explanations for why passive vocabulary size and active speaking ability can be so wildly different for the same person, even though it feels contradictory at first. They are not the same skill measured on the same scale. They are two related but distinct skills, and one of them, translation-heavy recognition, has typically been trained for years, while the other, direct, translation-free production, has typically been trained far less, if at all. Here is a practical way to start noticing your own translation habit, because awareness is always the first step before change becomes possible. The next time you attempt to speak English, either in a real conversation or in practice, pay close attention to what is happening in your mind in the half-second before you produce a sentence. Notice whether a native language thought appears first, followed by a search for English words, or whether the English words seem to arrive more directly, connected to the idea you want to express. You do not need to judge yourself for what you notice. You simply need to notice, because noticing is the beginning of retraining. Over time, as you practice the techniques we will build together in the coming chapters, specifically repeated, meaning focused, low-pressure spoken production, you will likely notice that this translation gap, the delay between a thought forming and English words arriving, begins to shrink. Words that used to require a conscious search will start to arrive more automatically. Phrases that used to feel like awkward translations will start to feel like natural, direct expressions of what you actually want to say. This shift, from translated English to directly produced English, is one of the single biggest markers of moving from an intermediate plateau toward true conversational fluency. It is not achieved by learning more vocabulary. It is achieved by using the vocabulary you already have directly, repeatedly, and out loud, until the translation step becomes unnecessary because the direct connection has already been built. I want to share a specific exercise that many learners find surprisingly powerful for weakening the translation habit, precisely because it forces a direct connection between concept and English word, without allowing the native language detour to happen at all. The exercise works like this. Instead of learning new English vocabulary through translated word pairs, where an English word sits next to its equivalent in your native language on a list or flashcard, you instead learn and review new vocabulary attached directly to an image, a short English definition, a real situation, or a physical action, with no native language word appearing anywhere in the process. When you later want to recall that word, you recall it by picturing the image, the situation, or the action, and reaching directly for the English word, rather than reaching first for the native language word and then searching for its English equivalent. This might feel slower and more effortful at first, particularly if you have spent years relying on translated vocabulary lists, because you are essentially asking your brain to build a new kind of connection rather than relying on an old, familiar one. But this initial effort is exactly the kind of productive difficulty that leads to stronger, more durable, more directly retrievable memories, precisely because you are bypassing the translation step from the very beginning, rather than building translation habits first and trying to remove them later. I also want to mention a related phenomenon that many multilingual speakers experience, sometimes called language mode or language switching cost. Multilingual speakers who have built strong, direct connections in more than one language often describe a noticeable shift in how their mind operates, depending on which language mode they are currently in. When fully in English mode, thoughts, associations, and even certain phrases tend to arise directly in English, without conscious translation. When switching back to their native language, a similar direct process occurs in the other direction. This kind of clean, direct language switching is not evidence of exceptional natural talent. It is the direct result of having built strong, direct form-to-meaning connections in both languages, through extensive practice using each language independently and directly, rather than constantly running one language through the other as an intermediate step. The good news here is that this kind of direct language mode is available to you as well, and it is built the same way for everyone, through repeated, direct, meaning-focused use of English, rather than through some rare, innate cognitive gift. Every hour you spend practicing direct retrieval, meaning focused speaking, and varied contextual repetition, moves you incrementally closer to this same direct language mode, where English arrives on its own terms, without first passing through your native language as a checkpoint. This shift tends to happen so gradually that you may not notice it directly until, one day, you catch yourself mid-conversation, realizing you had not translated a single sentence. I want to offer one more practical technique here, because it directly targets a very specific and common manifestation of the translation trap, something I call the missing word substitution habit. This is the common experience of knowing exactly what you want to say, reaching for a specific English word, failing to retrieve it in the moment, and either falling completely silent or reverting to your native language word instead, breaking the flow of the English sentence entirely. Rather than falling silent or reverting to your native language in this moment, a far more productive habit to build is what I call the describe around it strategy. Instead of stopping when a specific word will not come, you keep speaking in English, describing the concept using whatever simpler words you do have direct access to, even if the result is not the single, precise word a native speaker might use. For example, if the specific word for a particular kitchen tool will not come to you in the moment, rather than stopping or switching languages, you might say something like, the thing you use to mix food together, keeping the sentence entirely in English, keeping the conversation flowing, and, importantly, continuing to strengthen direct English retrieval rather than falling back into a translation-dependent pattern. This describe around it strategy serves two purposes simultaneously. It keeps real conversations flowing naturally, which is valuable in its own right, since conversations that stall completely tend to feel far more uncomfortable and often trigger the freeze reflex we discussed earlier. And it reinforces the deeper habit of staying inside English even when a specific word is temporarily inaccessible, rather than treating any gap in vocabulary as a signal to abandon English altogether and retreat to translation. Over time, as you practice this describe around it strategy consistently, you will likely notice two things happening simultaneously. First, your ability to communicate fluidly even with vocabulary gaps improves significantly, because you are building genuine skill in flexible, resourceful English expression, which is itself a valuable and underrated conversational skill, even among fairly advanced speakers. Second, you will often find that specific missing words, the ones you previously could not retrieve, begin arriving more easily over time, precisely because you continue engaging directly with English, rather than retreating from it the moment a gap appears. Be patient with this process. The describe around it strategy can feel clumsy at first, and that clumsiness is simply the sound of a genuinely useful new habit taking shape, not a sign that something has gone wrong. In the next chapter, we are going to build directly on this idea by examining exactly what retrieval practice is, why it is fundamentally different from every other kind of English practice you have likely been doing, and why a small, focused amount of the right kind of retrieval practice can produce more improvement in your actual speaking ability than months of additional passive study. Chapter 4. The retrieval reflex. There is a concept from the science of learning that has completely transformed how researchers understand memory, and once you understand it, it will completely transform how you think about learning to speak English. It is called the testing effect, sometimes called retrieval practice, and it is one of the most well-documented, most consistently replicated findings in all of learning research. Here is the basic idea, stated as simply as possible. The act of pulling information out of your memory strengthens that memory far more powerfully than the act of putting information into your memory. In other words, retrieving something you have learned, actively recalling it, actively producing it, is a far more powerful learning event than reviewing it, rereading it, or listening to it again. This might sound like a small, technical detail, but its implications are enormous, especially for language learning. Most English learners spend the overwhelming majority of their study time on input activities, rereading vocabulary lists, re-listening to lessons, re-watching English videos, re-reviewing grammar notes. These activities feel productive, and in a limited sense they are, because they do build recognition and comprehension. But according to decades of memory research, These input-heavy activities are far less effective at building strong, retrievable, speakable memories than the simple act of trying to recall and produce the information yourself, even if you get it wrong at first. I want to pause on this point for a moment longer, because the strength of this finding across so many different studies and contexts is genuinely remarkable, and it deserves more attention than a brief passing mention. Researchers have tested this effect using vocabulary lists, historical facts, scientific concepts, and even foreign language material specifically, comparing groups who spent equal amounts of study time and either rereading material or attempting to recall it from memory. Across this wide range of studies, the pattern remains strikingly consistent. The group that engaged in effortful recall, even when that recall was frequently incorrect during practice, consistently outperformed the rereading group on delayed tests given days or weeks later. This finding held even in cases where the rereading group reported feeling more confident about their learning immediately after studying, which points to an important and somewhat humbling insight. Our subjective feeling of how well we have learned something during a study session is often a poor and misleading predictor of how well we will actually be able to retrieve that same information later, particularly under the pressure of a real test, or in our case, a real conversation. Let me give you a concrete example of how dramatic this difference can be. In classic memory research, when students study material and then either reread it again or attempt to recall it from memory, even when they recall it incorrectly at first, the group that attempted recall consistently performs significantly better on later tests, sometimes dramatically better, than the group that simply reread the same material the same number of times. This finding has been replicated across many different subjects, many different age groups, and many different types of material. For language learning specifically, this means something very direct and very actionable. If you want a word, a phrase, or a grammar pattern to become something you can actually speak, fluently, under pressure, in real conversation, the single most effective thing you can do is practice retrieving and producing that exact word, phrase, or pattern yourself, out loud, from memory, repeatedly, rather than simply rereading it or listening to it again and again. This single shift in where you invest your practice time is, more than any other single change, the one most likely to close the gap between what you understand and what you can say. This explains something that confuses many English learners deeply. Why can I recognize a word instantly when I read it, but completely fail to produce that same word when I need it in conversation? The answer connects directly to what we just discussed. Reading a word is a recognition task. Your brain matches the word on the page to a meaning already stored somewhere inside you. This is a relatively easy cognitive task, and importantly, it is not the same cognitive task as retrieval, generating that word yourself from an internal need, with no external prompt in front of you. You can read a word correctly 1,000 times and still struggle to retrieve it in conversation, because reading trains recognition, and conversation requires retrieval. These are related but distinct mental skills, built through different kinds of practice, and only one of them, retrieval practice, directly trains the skill you actually need for speaking. I want you to think back now to how many hours of your life you have spent rereading English material, re-listening to English audio, re-watching English videos. For most serious English learners, this number is enormous, often thousands of hours across many years. Now I want you to honestly estimate how many hours you have spent specifically practicing retrieval, meaning actively producing English sentences from memory, out loud, using your own voice, without reading from a script, without having the answer already provided to you. For the vast majority of English learners, this second number is dramatically smaller than the first, often by a factor of 10 or more. This imbalance, an enormous amount of input practice, and a tiny amount of retrieval practice, is, more than almost any other single factor, the reason why comprehension and speaking ability diverge so dramatically for so many learners. Here is the truly exciting part of this entire idea, the part that should genuinely change how you approach your practice starting today. Because retrieval practice is so much more powerful per minute than input practice, you do not need to spend more total hours studying English to see dramatic improvement in your speaking ability. You simply need to shift a portion of the hours you are already spending from purely receptive activities toward active retrieval activities, and the efficiency of your practice time increases substantially. This means that someone who studies English for 30 minutes a day, but spends even 10 of those minutes on genuine spoken retrieval practice, will very often develop stronger speaking ability over a period of months than someone who studies for 2 hours a day, entirely through reading and listening, with zero spoken retrieval practice. This is not a small effect. It is one of the most consistent and powerful findings in the entire science of how memory and skill are built. So what does genuine retrieval practice actually look like for English speaking, in practical terms? Let me walk through several specific forms of it, because the details matter enormously here, and vague advice like just practice speaking more often fails to capture what actually makes retrieval practice effective. The first form is what I call cued production. This means being given a prompt, a question, a picture, a scenario, or a topic, and then attempting to produce a full spoken response entirely from memory, out loud, without reading a script or having the sentence provided to you in advance. The key requirement here is that you must generate the words yourself, from your own stored knowledge, under some degree of time pressure, rather than reading someone else's prepared sentence aloud. The second form is what I call self-questioning and answering. This means asking yourself questions in English and then answering them out loud in full sentences without writing the answer down first. For example, asking yourself, "What did you do this morning?" and then producing a spoken answer immediately, in English, using whatever vocabulary and grammar you currently have access to, imperfect as it may be. The third form is what I call description under time pressure. This means looking at an object, a photo, a scene, or a situation, and describing it out loud in English within a short time limit, forcing yourself to produce sentences quickly rather than slowly constructing a perfect sentence in your head before speaking. This time pressure element is important because real conversations do not wait patiently while you construct a perfect sentence. Training yourself to produce imperfect but immediate speech is far more useful for real conversation than training yourself to produce perfect but slow speech. The fourth form, and one of the most underrated, is what I call shadow retrieval. This is different from simple shadowing, where you repeat exactly what you hear immediately after hearing it. Shadow retrieval means listening to a short piece of English audio, then pausing it completely, and attempting to reproduce the sentence from memory, in your own words if necessary, rather than word for word. This small shift, from immediate repetition to delayed, memory-based reproduction, transforms a purely receptive activity into a genuine retrieval activity, dramatically increasing its effectiveness for building speaking ability. Now I want to address something that comes up almost every single time someone learns about retrieval practice for the first time, because it is a completely natural and understandable concern. If retrieval means producing English from memory without help, does that mean I am supposed to just struggle and make mistakes without any correction or guidance? This concern touches on something important, and the answer is a bit more nuanced than a simple yes or no. Retrieval practice does not mean practicing in a vacuum with no feedback whatsoever, and it certainly does not mean avoiding correction or improvement. What it means is that the correction and refinement should generally come after the retrieval attempt, not before it. You attempt to produce the sentence yourself, from memory, first, even if the result is imperfect. Then, afterward, you can compare your attempt to a better version, notice the differences, and refine your understanding. This sequence, attempt first, refine second, is far more effective for building speaking ability than the more common approach many learners use, which is studying a perfect example first and then trying to imitate it immediately, without ever attempting genuine, unprompted retrieval on your own. This sequence matters because the struggle itself, the effortful attempt to retrieve something that is not immediately available, is precisely the process that strengthens the neural pathway responsible for future retrieval. If you always see the correct answer before attempting to produce it yourself, you are training recognition and imitation, not independent retrieval, and independent retrieval is exactly the skill that real, spontaneous conversation requires. I want to bring this back to something deeply practical and specific, because understanding the theory behind retrieval practice matters far less than actually applying it consistently. Starting from today, I want you to begin distinguishing, in your own mind, between English activities that are primarily input-based and English activities that are primarily retrieval-based. When you read, when you listen, when you watch, notice that you are building comprehension, an important and necessary foundation, but not the specific skill of spoken production. When you attempt to speak, out loud, from memory, under some form of time pressure, without reading a script, notice that this is a fundamentally different and, for your speaking goals specifically, a far more valuable kind of practice. The goal moving forward is not to abandon input activities entirely. Comprehension remains an essential foundation, and continuing to read and listen to English will continue to expand your receptive vocabulary and deepen your understanding of natural English patterns. The goal is to intentionally, deliberately, and consistently add genuine retrieval practice into your routine, even in small amounts, because retrieval practice is the specific ingredient that has likely been missing from your English learning for years, and it is the ingredient most directly responsible for converting your enormous passive knowledge into confident, fluent, spoken English. I want to address one more important nuance about retrieval practice, because it often determines whether someone actually experiences its benefits or gives up on it prematurely, concluding incorrectly that it does not work for them personally. Retrieval practice, almost by definition, feels harder and less comfortable than passive review. When you attempt to recall a word or produce a sentence from memory and you struggle, hesitate, or get it wrong, this experience can feel discouraging, especially compared to the comfortable, easy feeling of simply rereading or re-listening to material you already recognize. This discomfort, counterintuitively, is not a sign that retrieval practice is failing you. It is, in fact, a sign that genuine learning is occurring, because the very act of effortful, sometimes unsuccessful retrieval is what strengthens the neural pathway responsible for future, easier retrieval. Researchers studying this phenomenon have described it as desirable difficulty, meaning a level of difficulty during practice that feels somewhat uncomfortable and effortful in the moment, but that produces significantly stronger, more durable learning compared to easier, more comfortable practice methods. This concept directly explains why passive review, rereading, and re-listening feels more pleasant during the practice itself, while producing weaker actual retention and speaking ability, and why retrieval practice feels more effortful and sometimes frustrating during the practice itself, while producing significantly stronger actual retention and speaking ability over time. Understanding this distinction matters enormously for your own motivation and persistence. If you begin practicing genuine spoken retrieval and find it uncomfortable, effortful, or occasionally frustrating, especially in the early stages, this is not evidence that something is wrong or that this approach does not work for you. It is precisely the expected, normal sensation of desirable difficulty at work, the same sensation experienced by essentially everyone who has ever built a new skill through genuine, effortful practice, whether that skill is a language, a musical instrument, a sport, or any other complex human ability. I also want to offer a specific, practical structure for how to organize retrieval practice sessions, because vague advice to just practice retrieval more often is far less useful than a concrete structure you can actually follow. A useful structure involves what I call the 3-pass method. In the first pass, you attempt to answer a question, describe a scene, or produce a sentence entirely from memory, without any assistance, accepting that the result may be imperfect, hesitant, or incomplete. In the second pass, you compare your attempt to a stronger, more polished version of the same idea, whether from a native speaker resource, a more fluent friend, or even a well-constructed example sentence you find in a dictionary or learning resource, noticing specifically where your attempt differed and why. In the third pass, you attempt to produce the same idea again, entirely from memory, incorporating what you noticed during the comparison step, without simply repeating the polished version word for word. This 3-pass method combines the power of genuine retrieval, attempting production before seeing the answer, with the value of feedback and refinement, comparing your attempt to a stronger model, without falling into the common trap of skipping straight to imitation, which trains recognition and repetition rather than the independent retrieval skill that real conversation actually requires. Even a quick, informal version of this 3-pass method, applied to just a handful of sentences a day, compounds meaningfully over weeks of consistent use. I want to add one more encouraging note here before we move on, because it directly addresses a discouragement many learners feel once they start genuinely attempting retrieval practice for the first time. If your early attempts feel slow, clumsy, and full of hesitation, this is not evidence that retrieval practice is somehow not working for you personally, or that you are unusually bad at this compared to other learners. It is simply the visible, expected signature of a pathway that is still relatively weak and is actively being strengthened through the very discomfort you are feeling. The learners who eventually experience the smoothest, most automatic-sounding fluency are, almost without exception, the ones who tolerated this uncomfortable early stage long enough for consistent practice to do its work, rather than the ones who happen to start with some special natural advantage. In the next chapter, we are going to look at a very specific and often overlooked reason why so many English learners avoid retrieval practice entirely, even after understanding how powerful it is. It is a deeply ingrained habit, formed over years of traditional schooling, and it has quietly trained millions of English learners to associate silence with safety and speech with risk. Understanding this habit, and specifically how it was built, is the key to finally being able to break it. Chapter 5. The Silence Habit. I want you to think back to your very first English classroom, wherever and whenever that was. Picture the room. Picture the teacher standing at the front. Picture the other students sitting quietly at their desks. Now I want you to remember something about how that classroom actually operated, because the answer reveals something most people have never consciously noticed about their own English education. In the overwhelming majority of English classrooms around the world, for the overwhelming majority of English learners, speaking time is scarce, and silence is the default state. A single teacher stands in front of 20, 30, sometimes 40 students. Class periods last perhaps 45 minutes to an hour. If you do simple arithmetic, dividing the available speaking time by the number of students in the room, you quickly realize that in a typical English class, each individual student might get somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 or 3 minutes of actual personal speaking time, if they are lucky, and that is often being generous. Everything else, the vast majority of classroom time, is spent listening to the teacher explain grammar rules, listening to other students attempt to answer questions, silently completing written exercises, silently reading passages, silently taking notes. Across years of formal English education, from primary school through university, this pattern repeats itself thousands of times. Enormous amounts of silent listening and reading. Tiny, scattered fragments of actual personal speaking time. Now here is the crucial part, the part that most people never stop to consider. Your brain does not simply store information neutrally. Your brain forms habits based on repeated patterns of behavior, and it forms strong associations based on what behaviors are repeated most frequently and most consistently, over the longest periods of time. If, across years of English education, the overwhelmingly dominant behavior associated with the English language is silent reception, listening, reading, absorbing, and the rare occasional behavior associated with English is nervous, high-stakes evaluated speech, your brain will naturally and predictably form a strong association. English equals silence. English equals listening. Speaking English equals a rare, high-pressure, evaluated event, rather than a normal, everyday, low-stakes activity. This is what I call the silence habit, and I want to be very precise about what I mean by this term, because it is easy to misunderstand. The silence habit is not simply the fact that you have not practiced speaking enough, although that is certainly part of the picture. The silence habit is a deeply ingrained behavioral and emotional pattern, built over years of repetition, in which silence has become your brain's automatic, comfortable, default response to the English language, while speech has become associated with evaluation, judgment, and risk. Think about how this plays out in real, everyday situations outside the classroom. An English learner watches an English video and understands it easily, comfortably, without any anxiety at all, because watching and understanding fit the deeply familiar pattern built over years. Silent reception equals safe and normal. That same learner is then asked a simple question by an English-speaking colleague and immediately experiences a spike of discomfort, hesitation, and anxiety. Because speaking breaks the deeply familiar pattern, silent reception equals safe and normal, and instead enters the much rarer, much less practiced, much more anxiety-associated pattern. Active speech production equals risky and abnormal. This is not a character flaw, and it is not a sign of low confidence in some general, personal sense. It is the completely predictable result of an educational system, and often a self-study pattern, that has spent years training a single behavior, silent reception, thousands of times more frequently than the opposite behavior, active spoken production. Your nervous system has simply learned, through sheer repetition, which behavior feels normal and which behavior feels exceptional and threatening. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge that this silence-heavy structure was never designed maliciously, and it is not the result of any individual teacher's poor judgment. It emerged largely from practical constraints, large class sizes, limited instructional time, and standardized testing systems that primarily evaluate reading and grammar knowledge rather than spoken fluency. Understanding that the silence habit emerged from structural, systemic constraints rather than from any personal deficiency in you or your teachers is important, because it removes an unhelpful layer of blame from the equation entirely. Nobody failed you by teaching within a system built this way. The system itself simply was not optimized for the specific goal you now hold, confident spoken fluency, and recognizing this clearly allows you to address the resulting gap directly and practically, without unnecessary guilt or self-blame clouding the process. I want to draw a comparison here that I think makes this especially clear. Imagine someone who has spent 10 years going to the gym exclusively to watch other people lift weights, read detailed books about weightlifting technique, and occasionally, for 30 seconds every few months, attempt to lift a very small weight themselves under the anxious observation of an instructor. After 10 years of this pattern, would it be surprising if this person felt physically awkward, hesitant, and anxious the very first time they were asked to lift a genuinely heavy weight in front of other people, even though they possessed enormous theoretical knowledge about proper lifting technique? Of course, it would not be surprising. The mismatch between years of passive observation and minimal active practice would predict exactly this kind of discomfort and hesitation. And yet, when this exact same mismatch happens with language learning, years of passive reception and minimal active spoken practice, many learners interpret their resulting hesitation and anxiety as a personal failure, a sign that they are simply bad at languages, rather than the entirely predictable and logical consequence of an unbalanced practice history. This reframing matters enormously, because how you interpret your own hesitation directly affects whether you continue avoiding speaking practice, deepening the silence habit further, or whether you begin deliberately, intentionally working to rebalance it. Now here is a question worth asking directly. If the silence habit was built through years of repeated silent reception, vastly outweighing active speech, how exactly can it be undone? The disappointing but honest answer is that it cannot be undone through more silent reception, no matter how much more of it you do. Watching more English videos will not rebalance a pattern that was created by an excess of watching and a deficit of speaking. The only way to rebalance this pattern is through the deliberate, repeated practice of the underrepresented behavior, active spoken production, until it becomes as familiar, as automatic, and as comfortable as silent reception currently feels. This might sound discouraging at first, as if it requires years more work to undo years of imbalance. But there is genuinely good news here, and it is important to understand why. Habits, even deeply ingrained ones built over many years, do not require an equal number of years to change. The brain remains remarkably capable of updating its patterns and associations throughout adulthood, a property researchers call neuroplasticity, and we will explore this concept in much greater depth in the next chapter. What matters most for rebalancing the silence habit specifically is not the total number of years spent practicing, but the consistency, frequency, and directness of the new pattern you introduce. In practical terms, this means that a relatively modest but highly consistent amount of daily spoken retrieval practice, even 10 or 15 minutes a day, practiced consistently over a period of weeks and months, can begin to meaningfully shift this deeply ingrained silence habit, far faster than most people expect. This is because consistency and repetition, not sheer total hours, are the primary drivers of habit formation and neural rewiring. I want to walk through a few of the specific ways the silence habit tends to show up in daily behavior, because recognizing these patterns in your own life is an essential step toward changing them. The first pattern is what I call the preparation trap. This is the tendency to feel that you need to fully prepare, fully understand, and fully perfect your English before you are allowed to attempt speaking it out loud. This preparation trap feels responsible and careful on the surface, but in practice, it often becomes an endless delay, because there is always more vocabulary to learn, more grammar to review, more content to consume before you feel ready. The preparation trap is, in many cases, simply the silence habit wearing a more socially acceptable disguise, one that feels like diligent study rather than avoidance, while functionally producing the exact same outcome, more silent reception and continued avoidance of active spoken practice. The second pattern is what I call the perfect sentence trap. This is the tendency, once you do attempt to speak, to mentally construct an entire sentence, carefully checking its grammar and word choice, before allowing yourself to actually say it out loud. This internal editing process, while well-intentioned, often takes so long that the natural rhythm of conversation moves past you. Another person fills the silence, or the moment to respond simply passes. Over time, repeatedly experiencing this delay reinforces the belief that speaking is slow, effortful, and difficult, when in reality, it is often the internal perfectionism, not the language ability itself, that creates the delay. The third pattern is what I call silent substitution. This is the tendency to substitute genuine spoken practice with something that feels similar but is fundamentally passive, such as watching videos about how to speak more confidently, reading articles about English fluency tips, or making detailed study plans for future speaking practice that never quite begins. These activities can feel productive, and in small amounts they can genuinely provide useful information. But when they consistently replace actual spoken retrieval practice, they quietly extend the silence habit indefinitely, disguised as preparation for a spoken practice that keeps being postponed. There is one more pattern worth naming here, closely related to the three described above, which I call comparison paralysis. This is the tendency to mentally compare your own current spoken English to the polished, edited, often rehearsed English you encounter in videos, podcasts, or professionally produced content, and to feel discouraged by the gap, concluding that your own unscripted attempts are simply not good enough to be worth practicing out loud yet. This comparison is fundamentally unfair to yourself, because it compares your unpracticed, in-progress spoken retrieval to someone else's finished, rehearsed, or professionally edited product, rather than to that same person's own early unpracticed attempts, which were almost certainly far more hesitant and imperfect than the polished version you are comparing yourself against. Recognizing comparison paralysis when it arises, and gently setting it aside in favor of simply beginning your own practice regardless of how it currently sounds, is an important part of breaking free from the silence habit for good. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty serves you far better than false comfort here. Breaking the silence habit will feel uncomfortable at first, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The very first times you deliberately practice spoken retrieval, especially after years of the silence habit being reinforced, will likely feel awkward, effortful, and even a little bit anxiety-inducing. This discomfort is not a sign that something is going wrong. It is the expected, normal sensation of asking your nervous system to do something unfamiliar, something it has not been asked to do frequently before. This discomfort tends to decrease relatively quickly with consistent practice, often within a matter of weeks, sometimes even faster, precisely because the brain adapts efficiently to repeated exposure, provided that exposure remains at a manageable, non-overwhelming intensity. This is why the specific structure of your practice, small, consistent, gradually increasing spoken practice rather than occasional, high-stakes, overwhelming speaking attempts, matters so enormously for actually breaking the silence habit rather than accidentally reinforcing it. Trust that structure even on the days it feels slow, because slow, steady exposure is precisely what teaches a nervous system that a once threatening situation has, in fact, become safe. Before we move into the next chapter, I want you to take a moment to honestly identify which of these patterns, the preparation trap, the perfect sentence trap, or silent substitution, has been most present in your own English learning journey. There is no need for judgment here. Simply noticing which pattern applies to you most strongly is an important and necessary step, because you cannot deliberately change a pattern you have never consciously recognized. You might notice more than one of these patterns showing up at different times, depending on the situation, the day, or even your mood, and that is completely normal. The goal is not to sort yourself neatly into a single category, but to build enough honest awareness that the next time one of these patterns appears, you can recognize it in the moment for what it actually is, a familiar disguise for the same underlying silence habit, rather than a brand new, unrelated obstacle each time. I want to share one more angle on the silence habit because it helps explain something that puzzles many English learners deeply: the experience of feeling far more articulate and confident in written English, such as messaging apps or emails, than in spoken English, even though both forms use overlapping vocabulary and grammar. Written communication, even informal written communication like text messages, shares an important structural feature with the silent reception patterns we have been discussing. It allows time. You can pause, reconsider, revise, and even delete and rewrite a message before sending it, all without any real-time social observation of that hesitation. This means that written English practice, while valuable in many ways, still does not directly train the specific skill of real-time, unedited, immediately observed spoken production, the skill that live conversation actually demands. This is why so many English learners describe feeling like two different people, a confident, articulate writer and a hesitant, anxious speaker, despite drawing from what is largely the same underlying vocabulary and grammar knowledge. The difference is not in the knowledge itself. The difference is in which specific skill, delayed written production versus immediate spoken production, has actually been practiced and strengthened over time. I want to be very specific about a distinction that will help you evaluate your own practice more accurately going forward. Not all speaking practice equally breaks the silence habit. Reading a script out loud, for example, while technically involving your voice, still relies heavily on recognition and repetition rather than genuine, spontaneous production, and therefore provides a much weaker version of the exposure needed to truly rebalance years of silent reception. Similarly, rehearsing a memorized response to an anticipated question, while useful in limited contexts such as job interviews, does not train the flexible, unpredictable, real-time retrieval that spontaneous conversation actually requires. The most powerful antidote to the silence habit specifically involves unscripted, spontaneous, real-time spoken production, ideally involving genuine uncertainty about exactly what you will need to say next, because this uncertainty is precisely the element that has been almost entirely absent from years of passive, silent, comfortable English exposure. This does not mean scripted practice or rehearsal has no value at all, particularly for absolute beginners building initial confidence. It means that as your goal shifts toward genuine conversational fluency, an increasing proportion of your practice needs to move toward unscripted, spontaneous production. Specifically, because that is the exact skill the silence habit has left underdeveloped for so long, and no amount of additional scripted rehearsal will substitute for it. In the next chapter, we are going to move from understanding the problem to understanding the solution at a deeper, more scientific level. We are going to explore exactly how your brain physically changes when you practice something new and unfamiliar, a property called neuroplasticity, and we are going to use this understanding to build a specific, practical framework for rewiring your brain toward automatic, confident, effortless spoken English. Chapter 6: Rewiring for Speech. For a very long time, scientists believed that the adult brain was essentially fixed, that its basic structure and connections were set in place by a certain age, and that meaningful change after that point was simply not possible. Under this older view, an adult struggling to speak a new language fluently would be, in a very real sense, stuck, limited by a biological ceiling that no amount of practice could meaningfully raise. This older view has been thoroughly overturned by decades of modern neuroscience. We now understand that the adult brain remains capable of significant structural and functional change throughout life, a property known as neuroplasticity. The brain is not a fixed, unchangeable machine. It is closer to a living structure that continuously reshapes itself based on how it is used, strengthening pathways that are used frequently, and gradually weakening pathways that fall into disuse. This is not a vague, feel-good metaphor. It reflects real, measurable changes at the level of neurons and their connections. When you repeatedly practice a specific mental or physical skill, the neural pathways involved in that skill become more efficient. The connections between relevant neurons strengthen. Signals travel faster and more reliably along frequently used pathways. Over time, an action that once required enormous conscious effort, careful, slow, deliberate thought, gradually becomes smoother, faster, and eventually, largely automatic. This exact process is precisely how every fluent speaker of every language, including your own native language, develop their ability to speak effortlessly. Fluency is not evidence of superior natural talent. Fluency is evidence of a heavily practiced, heavily strengthened neural pathway, built through extensive repeated use, to the point where the relevant retrieval and production processes require minimal conscious effort. Here is why this matters so directly for you as an English learner. Every single time you attempt to speak an English word or sentence, especially through active retrieval and production rather than passive recognition, you are engaging and strengthening a specific set of neural pathways associated with producing that particular English output. Each attempt, each repetition, strengthens this pathway slightly further, gradually making future retrieval of that same word or sentence structure faster, easier, and more automatic. This means that the effortful, hesitant, slow speaking you may be experiencing right now is not a permanent state, and it is not evidence of some fixed limitation in your ability. It is simply evidence of pathways that have not yet been sufficiently strengthened through repeated, active use, precisely because, as we discussed in the previous chapter, your practice history has likely been heavily weighted toward passive reception rather than active production. Let's talk about what this actually implies for how you should structure your practice, because understanding neuroplasticity in the abstract is far less useful than applying its principles directly and practically. The first principle is repetition with active engagement. Neural pathways strengthen most effectively when practice involves genuine, effortful engagement, rather than passive repetition. This connects directly back to the retrieval practice we discussed earlier. Simply repeating a sentence you are reading from a script, while somewhat useful, engages your brain far less deeply than attempting to generate that same sentence from memory, under mild pressure, without the script in front of you. The more actively engaged your brain is during practice, the more effectively the relevant neural pathways strengthen. The second principle is specificity of practice. Neural pathways strengthen specifically for the skill being practiced, not generically for language ability as a whole. This means that practicing reading comprehension strengthens pathways related to reading comprehension, and practicing listening strengthens pathways related to listening, but neither of these directly strengthens the specific pathways responsible for real-time spoken production. If your goal is confident, fluent speaking, your practice must specifically and directly involve spoken production, ideally under conditions that resemble real conversation as closely as possible, including time pressure and the need to generate original sentences rather than repeat memorized ones. This principle of specificity explains something that often frustrates English learners deeply. Why, after years of extensive reading and listening practice, does speaking still feel so much harder and less developed than comprehension? The answer, again, is not a mystery once you understand specificity of practice. Reading and listening practice strengthen reading and listening pathways very effectively. They do not, on their own, strengthen the distinct pathways responsible for real-time spoken retrieval and production nearly as much, because that is simply not the specific skill being exercised during those particular activities. The third principle is manageable difficulty. Neural pathways strengthen most effectively when practice occurs at a level of difficulty that is challenging enough to require genuine effort, but not so overwhelming that it triggers the kind of intense stress response we discussed in the chapter on the freeze reflex. Practice that is too easy, simply repeating words you already speak fluently, provides little additional strengthening, because minimal new effort is required. Practice that is too difficult, attempting complex, high-stakes conversations far beyond your current comfortable ability, can trigger such an intense threat response that the resulting stress actively interferes with effective learning and pathway strengthening, and can even reinforce anxiety around speaking rather than reducing it. The ideal zone for practice, sometimes referred to in learning research as the zone of manageable challenge, involves material and situations that require genuine effort and stretch your current ability slightly, without triggering overwhelming stress. Finding and consistently practicing within this zone is one of the most important skills you can develop as a self-directed language learner, because it maximizes the rate at which your speaking pathways strengthen while minimizing the risk of reinforcing anxiety or avoidance. The fourth principle, and one that is frequently underappreciated, is consistency over intensity. Neural pathways strengthen more reliably and durably through frequent moderate practice sessions spread out over time, rather than through occasional, intense practice sessions crammed together. This is closely related to a well-established finding in learning research called spaced repetition, or the spacing effect, which demonstrates that learning distributed across multiple sessions, with breaks in between, produces stronger, more durable memory formation than the same total amount of practice concentrated into a single long session. There is a related and slightly more nuanced version of the spacing effect that is also worth understanding, sometimes described as increasing intervals. This refers to the finding that the ideal gap between practice sessions for a given piece of material tends to grow slightly longer as that material becomes more solidly learned. In practical terms, this means that a newly introduced target word might benefit from being practiced again within a day or two of first encountering it, while a word you have already practiced successfully many times over several weeks can often be revisited less frequently, perhaps once every week or two, without any meaningful loss of retrieval strength. You do not need to track this with rigid precision or complicated scheduling systems to benefit from the underlying principle. Simply understanding that newer material benefits from more frequent, closer-together practice, while more established material can be revisited more occasionally, is enough to naturally guide how you allocate your daily targeted vocabulary activation time in a sensible, efficient way. For your spoken English practice specifically, this means that 15 minutes of genuine, active spoken retrieval practice, done consistently every single day, will very likely produce stronger, more durable improvement in your speaking fluency than a single 2-hour speaking practice session done once a week, even though the total weekly practice time is roughly similar in the second scenario. Consistency, the daily habit of engaging your speaking pathways, matters more for durable neural change than occasional, longer bursts of practice. I want to bring these 4 principles together into something concrete and actionable, because understanding neuroplasticity conceptually is only valuable if it changes how you actually structure your daily practice. Effective spoken English practice, designed specifically to strengthen the neural pathways responsible for fluent, confident speech, should involve genuine active retrieval, meaning you generate sentences from memory rather than reading or repeating scripted material. It should specifically target spoken production, meaning it involves actually using your voice out loud, rather than silent reading, silent listening, or silent mental rehearsal alone. It should occur at a manageable level of difficulty, meaning the material and situations should stretch your current ability without overwhelming you into a stress response. And it should occur consistently, ideally daily or near daily, in relatively short, focused sessions, rather than occasionally in long, infrequent sessions. This framework, active retrieval, spoken production, manageable difficulty, and daily consistency, forms the foundation of what we specifically mean by rewiring your brain for speech. It is not a mysterious or complicated process. It is the direct, practical application of well-established neuroscience principles to the specific goal of converting your existing passive English knowledge into confident, automatic, spoken fluency. I also want to address something encouraging about how this process tends to unfold over time, because understanding the typical trajectory can help you stay consistent, even when progress feels slow at first. In the earliest stages of rewiring for speech, improvement often feels minimal and effortful. Sentences that require active retrieval still feel slow, still require conscious effort, still involve noticeable hesitation. This is completely expected, and it mirrors the early stages of learning any new physical or mental skill, when new neural pathways are still relatively weak and require significant conscious effort to activate. With consistent practice over a period of several weeks, most learners begin to notice a meaningful shift. Certain frequently practiced sentences, questions, and response patterns begin to feel noticeably more automatic, requiring less conscious effort to produce. This is direct, tangible evidence that the relevant neural pathways are strengthening, exactly as the principles of neuroplasticity would predict, and it is worth pausing to genuinely notice and acknowledge these small shifts when they happen, rather than dismissing them as too minor to matter. As practice continues consistently over months, this automaticity tends to expand further, covering a wider range of vocabulary, sentence structures, and conversational situations, gradually approaching the effortless, direct retrieval that characterizes genuinely fluent speech. This trajectory, slow and effortful at first, gradually more automatic with consistent practice, is not unique to language learning. It is the same trajectory observed in the development of virtually every complex human skill, from playing a musical instrument, to learning a new sport, to developing expertise in any professional field. The specific mechanism, the strengthening of relevant neural pathways through consistent, active, appropriately challenging practice, remains remarkably consistent across all of these different domains. I want to leave you with one final important idea before we move into the next and final chapter, because it directly connects everything we have discussed so far into a single, unified picture. Your enormous existing passive English knowledge, built over years of reading, listening, and studying, represents an incredibly valuable foundation. It means you are not starting from zero. It means the raw material, the vocabulary, the grammar patterns, the understanding of how English sentences are structured, already exists richly within your mind. What has been missing is not more raw material. What has been missing is not more raw material. What has been missing is not more raw material. What has been missing is not more raw material. What has been missing is not more raw material. What has been missing is not more raw material. Of actively retrieving and producing that material out loud, under conditions that gradually train your nervous system to treat spoken English as safe and normal, rather than threatening and rare. Everything you have learned in the previous chapters, the distinction between receptive and productive knowledge, the freeze reflex and how to calm it through graduated exposure, the translation trap and how to bypass it through direct, meaning focused practice, the power of retrieval practice over passive review, and the silence habit built through years of imbalanced practice, all of these ideas converge into a single, clear conclusion. Your path to fluent, confident, effortless spoken English does not primarily require more input. It requires a deliberate, consistent, appropriately structured practice of active spoken retrieval, built specifically around the principles of neuroplasticity we have just explored. I want to introduce one more concept here that many people find genuinely clarifying, because it offers a concrete, physical image for something that can otherwise feel abstract. When neural pathways are used repeatedly, a biological process occurs in which a fatty substance called myelin gradually wraps around the relevant nerve fibers, similar to insulation wrapping around an electrical wire. This myelin sheath allows electrical signals to travel along that particular neural pathway significantly faster and more efficiently than they would along an unmyelinated pathway. This process, sometimes described informally as building muscle memory, though it technically involves the nervous system far more broadly than muscles alone, is a large part of why repeated practice of any skill, from playing a musical instrument to speaking a language, tends to produce noticeably smoother, faster, and more automatic performance over time. This gives us a genuinely useful physical metaphor for what is happening every single time you practice active spoken retrieval in English. Each repetition is not simply repetition for its own sake. Each repetition is directly contributing to a physical strengthening process along the specific neural pathway responsible for retrieving and producing that particular word, phrase, or sentence structure. The hesitant, effortful sentence you produce today, requiring visible conscious effort to construct, is traveling along a pathway that is still in the relatively early stages of this myelination process. The same sentence, practiced consistently and repeatedly over subsequent weeks, travels along an increasingly well-insulated, increasingly efficient pathway, which is precisely why it begins to feel faster, smoother, and less effortful over time, exactly matching the subjective experience so many learners report as they move from hesitant, effortful early practice toward more automatic, confident later fluency. I find this physical understanding valuable because it replaces a somewhat vague, almost mystical notion of talent or natural ability with a concrete, mechanistic understanding of what is actually happening inside your nervous system. Fluent speakers of English, including native speakers, are not fundamentally different from you in terms of their underlying neurological architecture. They simply have significantly more myelinated, significantly more strengthened neural pathways specifically for the act of producing English speech, built through years, and in the case of native speakers, an entire childhood, of extensive, repeated, active spoken practice. This is not a permanent, unbridgeable gap. It is a difference in the current state of pathway development, a state that continues to change, at any age, in direct response to how you practice going forward. I want to address a question that naturally arises once someone understands neuroplasticity for the first time, because it touches on a common and understandable worry. Does age affect how quickly these speaking pathways can be strengthened? It is true that certain aspects of language acquisition, particularly the acquisition of native-like pronunciation in every phoneme, tend to show some sensitivity to age, with very young children often developing certain sound distinctions more effortlessly than adults. However, this specific, narrow finding about phonological acquisition has often been overgeneralized into a much broader and largely inaccurate belief that adults simply cannot build strong new language pathways at all, or that meaningful fluency improvement becomes essentially impossible past a certain age. This broader belief is not well supported by the evidence. Countless adults, well into their 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, have achieved genuinely fluent, confident speaking ability in a second language, often after decades of struggling with exactly the kind of access gap we have been discussing throughout this video. What differentiates those who successfully build this fluency from those who remain stuck is rarely age itself. It is far more consistently explained by the specific type, consistency, and appropriateness of their practice, precisely the factors we have been discussing throughout this chapter. I also want to address something about the emotional experience of neuroplastic change, because this often goes unmentioned in more clinical or academic discussions of the topic. As your speaking pathways strengthen through consistent practice, you may notice something interesting happening alongside the more obvious improvement in fluency itself. Your relationship with the English language and with the experience of speaking it often shifts in a deeper, more personal way as well. Many learners describe a kind of psychological relief that accompanies growing fluency, a sense that a part of their identity that had felt blocked or frustrated for years is finally becoming accessible and expressible. This emotional shift is not incidental to the neurological process we have been describing. It is, in many ways, a direct reflection of it, because reduced hesitation and increased automaticity in speech naturally reduce the anxiety and frustration that so often accompanied speaking attempts in the past. There is one final principle related to neuroplasticity that I want to introduce here, because it will directly shape how we build the practical protocol in the next chapter. This principle is sometimes called use-dependent plasticity, and it refers to the specific finding that the brain preferentially strengthens pathways that are used in ways that closely resemble the actual, real-world skill you ultimately want to perform. This means that practice which closely resembles genuine spoken conversation, involving spontaneity, mild time pressure, and genuine communicative intent, produces stronger transfer to real conversational fluency than practice which is highly artificial or disconnected from how language is actually used in real interactions, such as purely mechanical grammar drills performed in isolation, with no communicative purpose behind them. This is not to say that structured grammar study has no place at all in language learning. It simply means that if your primary goal is confident spoken fluency, the majority of your practice time should be weighted toward activities that closely resemble genuine spoken communication, rather than activities that, while useful for building explicit grammatical knowledge, do not closely resemble the real-time, spontaneous, meaning-focused nature of actual conversation. Balance, not elimination, is the goal here. I want to add one final thought here before we move into the practical protocol, because it connects the science we just covered back to something deeply personal. Every time you choose to attempt spoken retrieval, instead of retreating into silent reading or listening, you are not simply completing a task on a list. You are, quite literally, participating in the physical construction of a stronger, faster, more myelinated pathway inside your own nervous system. This is not an exaggeration or a motivational flourish. It is the direct, mechanistic result of the principles we have just walked through. Knowing this can change how you feel about even a single small, imperfect practice attempt, because that attempt is never wasted effort. It is a literal, physical contribution to the exact outcome you are working toward. With all of these principles now clearly established, active retrieval, specificity of practice, manageable difficulty, consistency over intensity, and use-dependent resemblance to real conversation, we are ready to assemble them into a single, coherent, practical daily protocol. In the final chapter, we are going to take everything we have discussed and turn it into a specific, practical, day-by-day framework, a reset protocol you can begin using immediately, designed specifically to convert your existing passive English knowledge into the confident, automatic, effortless spoken fluency you have been working toward for so long. Chapter 7. The Speaking Reset Protocol. Everything we have discussed so far has been building toward this moment, the moment where understanding becomes action. You now know that your brain already contains an enormous amount of English, built through years of reading, listening, and studying. You know that the gap between what you understand and what you can say is not a knowledge gap, but an access gap, caused by an underdeveloped retrieval pathway, an overactive freeze reflex, a persistent translation habit, and a deeply ingrained silence habit built through years of imbalanced practice. Now we are going to turn all of this understanding into a specific, practical, repeatable daily protocol, something you can begin using today, something designed specifically to rewire your brain toward confident, automatic spoken English, using the principles of retrieval practice, graduated exposure, direct form-to-meaning connections, and neuroplasticity that we have explored throughout this video. I want to be very clear about the philosophy behind this protocol before we get into the specific steps, because understanding why each part exists will make you far more likely to actually follow it consistently, rather than treating it as an arbitrary list of tasks. This protocol is built around one central goal: converting your existing passive knowledge into active, retrievable, spoken knowledge through small, consistent, appropriately challenging doses of genuine spoken retrieval practice, while gradually training your nervous system to experience spoken English as safe rather than threatening. The protocol has 5 components, and I want to walk through each one individually, explaining not just what to do, but why each component matters and how it connects to the principles we have already discussed. The first component is the daily retrieval warm-up. Every single day, ideally at the very start of your practice time, you are going to spend a small amount of time, somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes, engaging in pure retrieval practice with material you already know well. This might mean answering a set of simple, familiar questions out loud, such as describing your day, describing your surroundings, or explaining what you had for breakfast, using vocabulary and grammar patterns that feel comfortable and familiar to you. The purpose of this warm-up is not to challenge you or push you outside your comfort zone. The purpose is to activate your spoken retrieval pathways gently, at a low level of difficulty, before moving into more challenging practice. Think of this the same way an athlete warms up their muscles with light movement before attempting more intense physical activity. Just as sudden intense exercise without warming up increases the risk of injury, sudden attempts at difficult spoken English without a retrieval warm-up often trigger the freeze reflex more easily, because your speaking pathways have not yet been gently activated. This warm-up also serves a second important purpose. It provides an early, easy success experience at the very start of your practice session, which helps calm any anxiety before you move into more challenging material. Starting your practice with material you can produce comfortably and successfully builds momentum and confidence that carries forward into the rest of your session. The second component is targeted vocabulary activation. This is where we specifically address the translation trap discussed earlier. Choose a small number of words or phrases, somewhere between 5 and 10, that you want to move from passive to active vocabulary. These should ideally be words you already recognize and understand when reading or listening, but that you rarely or never produce yourself when speaking. For each of these chosen words or phrases, you are going to practice producing several different original sentences using that word, out loud, from memory, without writing the sentence down first. The key requirement here is variety. Rather than repeating the exact same sentence multiple times, which tends to create a rigid, narrow memory attached to one specific context, you want to generate several different sentences, in different contexts, using the same word. This directly implements the principle of repetition in varied contexts we discussed earlier, and it is specifically designed to build a direct, flexible, translation-free connection between the word and its meaning. For example, if your chosen word is the phrase, figure out, you might practice producing several different sentences out loud, such as describing figuring out a problem at work, figuring out directions to a new place, figuring out how to use a piece of technology, and figuring out a solution to a personal challenge. Each sentence uses the same target phrase in a genuinely different context, strengthening a flexible, directly retrievable connection rather than a single, rigid memorized sentence. The third component is description under time pressure, directly implementing the retrieval practice principles discussed in Chapter 4. Choose an object, a photo, a memory, or a scene, and describe it out loud in English, continuously, for a set period of time, somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, without stopping to search for perfect words or construct perfect grammar. The goal here is not perfection. The goal is fluency of production, meaning the ability to keep generating English words and sentences continuously, even imperfectly, under mild time pressure, without the long pauses and hesitations that come from waiting until you feel ready to speak. This component specifically targets the perfect sentence trap we discussed in the previous chapter. By deliberately practicing continuous, imperfect speech production under a time limit, you train yourself to prioritize keeping the conversation moving over constructing flawless sentences, which is exactly the skill required for natural, real-time conversation. The fourth component is graduated conversational exposure, directly addressing the freeze reflex from Chapter 2. This involves seeking out actual spoken interaction with another person, or in the absence of an available conversation partner, simulating conversational interaction as closely as possible, at a level of difficulty that feels challenging but manageable, rather than overwhelming. For learners who do not have consistent access to conversation partners, there are several practical alternatives that still provide meaningful graduated exposure. Speaking prompts that simulate real questions, recording yourself answering unscripted questions and listening back critically, or using voice-based practice with language exchange partners online, all provide a version of real-time, spontaneous, evaluated speech, which is precisely what your nervous system needs repeated, manageable exposure to in order to gradually recalibrate its threat response around English speaking. The key principle here is gradual escalation. If real, live conversation with another person currently feels overwhelming, begin with lower-pressure versions, such as recording yourself speaking alone, then gradually move towards slightly higher-pressure versions, such as brief voice messages to a patient language partner, and eventually toward live, real-time conversation. Each of these steps provides meaningful exposure at a manageable intensity, gradually building your tolerance for the specific pressure of real-time spoken evaluation, without overwhelming your nervous system in a way that reinforces the freeze reflex rather than reducing it. The fifth and final component is reflective review, which should happen briefly, ideally for just a minute or two, at the end of each practice session. This involves briefly noticing what felt difficult during your practice, which words or structures required noticeable effort to retrieve, and which felt more automatic and easy. This is not about harsh self-criticism. It is simply about building awareness of your own progress over time, and about identifying specific vocabulary or structures that might benefit from additional targeted practice in future sessions. Now I want to address something practical and important, because understanding a protocol in the abstract is very different from actually implementing it consistently in a busy, real-life schedule. The entire protocol described above can be completed in approximately 15 to 20 minutes per day. This is a deliberately modest time commitment because, as we discussed in the previous chapter, consistency matters more than intensity for building durable neural change. A 15-minute daily practice, followed consistently for several months, will very likely produce more meaningful improvement in your spoken fluency than an occasional, longer practice session done sporadically. I want to address one more frequently asked question directly, because it comes up almost every time this kind of protocol is introduced. Should you focus your practice on the specific vocabulary and situations most relevant to your work or daily life, such as workplace English or travel English, or should you practice more broadly across many different topics? The most effective answer, based on everything we have discussed about specificity of practice, is to weight your practice significantly, though not necessarily exclusively, toward the specific contexts where you most need and want to use English. If your primary goal is professional workplace communication, a large portion of your targeted vocabulary activation, your description exercises, and your conversational exposure should draw from workplace-relevant topics, situations, and vocabulary. If your primary goal is social conversation with friends, casual travel, or family communication, your practice should draw more heavily from those specific domains instead. This targeted approach ensures that the neural pathways you are strengthening most directly support the actual situations where you want and need fluent English the most, so it is worth taking a moment, before you begin your very first practice session, to simply name for yourself which of these domains matters most to you right now. That said, I do want to caution against making your practice so narrowly specialized that it becomes brittle, meaning you become highly fluent in a very narrow set of memorized workplace phrases, for example, while remaining just as hesitant and effortful the moment a conversation shifts even slightly outside that narrow domain. This is why the varied contexts principle we discussed earlier remains important even within a targeted practice approach. Within your chosen primary domain, continue varying the specific topics, situations, and vocabulary you practice, rather than repeatedly rehearsing the exact same narrow set of phrases, which would build a rigid, narrow fluency rather than the flexible, broadly applicable fluency that genuine conversational confidence requires. I also want to gently address something that I think deserves honest acknowledgement here, because I do not want to give you a falsely simple picture of this process. While the core principles behind this protocol are well established and genuinely effective, the actual experience of following through on daily practice, especially during weeks when progress feels slow or when life circumstances make consistency difficult, requires real, sustained effort and a degree of patience with yourself. This is not a criticism of you or a suggestion that you might fail. It is simply an honest acknowledgement that meaningful skill development in any domain, including spoken language fluency, unfolds gradually, through consistent effort sustained over weeks and months, rather than through a single dramatic breakthrough. Understanding this honestly, rather than expecting instant transformation, tends to produce far more durable, long-term commitment to the practice than an expectation of immediate, dramatic results ever could. This concern is understandable, but it somewhat misunderstands how skill development actually works. The effectiveness of practice depends far more on its specificity, its appropriate difficulty level, and its consistency than on its sheer total duration. 15 minutes of genuine, active, appropriately challenging spoken retrieval practice, done consistently every day, engages and strengthens the exact neural pathways responsible for spoken fluency, far more effectively than hours of passive reading or listening, precisely because of the specificity principle discussed in the previous chapter. I want to take a moment now to walk through what this protocol might look like across a full week, because seeing it laid out day by day often makes it feel far more concrete and achievable than hearing the 5 components described in the abstract. On the first day, you might begin your retrieval warm-up by describing your morning routine out loud, in as much detail as you can, using only vocabulary that already feels comfortable and familiar. You might then choose 5 target words you want to move from passive to active vocabulary. Perhaps words you have noticed yourself recognizing easily while reading, but never actually using in conversation, and produce 2 or 3 original spoken sentences for each one, out loud, from memory. You might then choose a photo on your phone and describe it out loud continuously for 1 minute, without pausing to search for perfect words. If you have access to a conversation partner, even briefly, you might exchange a few unscripted spoken messages or have a short, spontaneous conversation. You would close the session with a brief moment of reflection, simply noticing which parts felt easier and which parts required more visible effort. On the second day, the structure repeats, but the specific content changes. Perhaps your warm-up now involves describing your plans for the coming weekend instead of your morning routine. Perhaps your 5 target words are entirely new, chosen because you noticed them appearing in something you read or watched the previous day. The description exercise might involve a different photo, or perhaps describing a memory from several years ago rather than something currently in front of you. The specific content varies constantly, but the underlying structure, warm-up, targeted vocabulary activation, time description, graduated conversational exposure, and reflection remains stable and familiar, which is precisely what allows the habit itself to strengthen, even as the specific content changes daily. I want to emphasize something important about this variation in content. It is not simply for the sake of avoiding boredom, although that is a welcome side benefit. Varying the specific content while keeping the underlying structure consistent directly supports the goal of building flexible, broadly applicable retrieval pathways, rather than narrow, rigid pathways tied to one specific memorized scenario. This connects directly back to the principle of repetition in varied contexts discussed earlier in this video, and it applies just as much to the overall structure of your daily practice as it does to individual vocabulary items. I also want to address a common practical obstacle that many people encounter when they first attempt to implement this kind of daily protocol, which is simply finding a consistent time and space in an already busy schedule. I want to offer a specific, practical suggestion here, because vague encouragement to just make time rarely helps anyone actually build a lasting habit. Rather than searching for an entirely new, separate block of time in your day, which often fails because busy schedules leave very little genuinely free time available, I recommend attaching this practice to an existing daily routine you already reliably perform, a technique sometimes called habit stacking. For example, if you already reliably make coffee every morning, or reliably commute to work or school, or reliably take a walk at some point in your day, you can attach your speaking practice directly to that existing routine, practicing your retrieval warm-up while the coffee brews, practicing your description exercise during part of your commute, or practicing targeted vocabulary activation during a portion of your daily walk. This habit-stacking approach tends to be far more sustainable than attempting to carve out an entirely new, separate time slot, precisely because it relies on a routine your brain has already established as automatic and consistent, borrowing that existing consistency rather than trying to build an entirely new one from scratch. I want to address one more practical concern that comes up frequently, which is what to do on days when circumstances genuinely prevent you from completing the full protocol, whether due to illness, travel, unusually demanding work obligations, or simply an unusually difficult day. The honest and important answer here is that missing an occasional day, or even completing a significantly abbreviated version of the protocol on a difficult day, does not meaningfully undermine your overall progress, provided that missed days remain the occasional exception rather than the emerging new pattern. What matters far more than perfect, unbroken consistency is what I call directional consistency, meaning that across any given month, the overwhelming majority of days include at least some genuine spoken retrieval practice, even if a small handful of days include none at all due to unavoidable circumstances. This distinction matters because many people abandon a genuinely effective practice entirely after missing a single day, operating under an unhelpful, all-or-nothing mindset that treats any imperfection as a complete failure. A far more sustainable and ultimately more effective mindset treats occasional missed days as a normal, expected part of a long-term practice, rather than as evidence that the entire effort has failed and should be abandoned. Simply picking the practice back up the next day, without dwelling on the gap, is usually all that is needed to stay on track. I want to walk through what a realistic, gradual timeline of progress might look like, because setting appropriate expectations matters enormously for staying consistent through the early stages, when progress can feel slow and subtle. In the first 1 to 2 weeks of consistent daily practice, most learners notice relatively small, subtle changes. The practice itself may start to feel slightly less awkward and more familiar, simply through the process of becoming used to the specific components of the protocol. Actual speaking fluency during real conversations may not yet feel dramatically different, and this is completely normal and expected, given how gradually neural pathways strengthen in the earliest stages of new practice. Between roughly 3 and 6 weeks of consistent practice, many learners begin to notice more tangible changes. Certain frequently practiced words, phrases, and sentence patterns start to feel noticeably more automatic, arriving with less conscious effort and less hesitation. Small moments of genuine, real-time conversational fluency, brief exchanges that flow more smoothly than before, start to occur more frequently, even if overall conversational confidence is still developing. Between roughly 2 and 4 months of consistent practice, the changes tend to become considerably more noticeable and more stable. Many learners describe a genuine shift in how speaking English feels overall, from an effortful, anxiety-inducing task to something that, while still occasionally challenging, feels fundamentally more comfortable, more automatic, and less threatening. This is precisely the kind of shift predicted by the neuroplasticity principles discussed earlier, reflecting genuinely strengthened neural pathways built through months of consistent, active retrieval practice. I want to emphasize something important about this timeline. These are general patterns observed across many learners, not a rigid, guaranteed schedule. Individual progress varies based on many factors, including your starting level of passive vocabulary, the consistency of your practice, the specific difficulty level you choose for your practice, and individual differences in how quickly different people's nervous systems adapt to new patterns. Some people notice meaningful shifts a little earlier than these ranges suggest, and some people need a little longer, and both of these outcomes are completely within the range of normal, expected variation. The exact timeline matters far less than the underlying principle. Consistent, active, appropriately challenging spoken retrieval practice reliably produces meaningful improvement over time, even when that improvement is not immediately obvious from day to day. I also want to directly address something that often derails people's consistency with this kind of practice, which is the natural tendency to judge each individual practice session too harshly, based on how fluent or hesitant that particular session felt. It is important to understand that skill development, including spoken language fluency, does not improve in a perfectly smooth linear line. Some practice sessions will feel noticeably easier than others, influenced by factors as simple as how tired you are, how much stress you are experiencing in other areas of life, or even which specific topics or vocabulary happen to come up during that particular session. A single difficult practice session does not indicate that your progress has stalled or reversed. What matters is the overall trend across weeks and months of consistent practice, not the performance of any single individual session. I want to offer a specific bank of retrieval warm-up prompts here, because having a ready supply of simple, familiar questions removes one small but real obstacle: the friction of having to think of what to practice before you can actually begin practicing. You might ask yourself out loud, "What did you eat today?" and answer in as much detail as you comfortably can. You might ask yourself, "What is the weather like right now?" and describe it fully. You might ask yourself, "What is something you saw on your way to work or school today?" and describe it. You might ask yourself, "What are you looking forward to this week?" and explain why. You might ask yourself, "Describe your living room," or describe a person you spoke with recently, or describe your favorite meal in detail. None of these prompts requires advanced vocabulary or complex grammar. Their entire purpose is to activate spoken retrieval gently, using material that already feels comfortable, before you move into more challenging practice. I also want to offer some guidance on choosing target vocabulary for the second component of the protocol, because many learners struggle to identify which specific words are worth focusing their limited practice time on. A useful method here is to pay attention, over the course of your normal daily reading and listening, to words that you notice yourself understanding instantly and comfortably, but that you cannot remember ever having said yourself out loud. Keep a simple running list of these words, as you notice them throughout your week, and draw from this list when choosing your 5 to 10 target words for each practice session. This method ensures that your active vocabulary practice is always working directly on your specific, personal passive to active gap, rather than on generic vocabulary lists that may not reflect the words most relevant to your actual daily life and interests. I want to address a specific troubleshooting scenario that comes up often: the experience of attempting the description under time pressure component and finding yourself running out of things to say within the first 10 or 15 seconds, well before the full 30 seconds to 2 minutes have elapsed. This experience, while initially frustrating, is actually a valuable and informative signal, because it reveals exactly where your fluency currently breaks down under real-time pressure. A useful strategy for these moments is to practice a small set of filler and extension phrases that allow you to keep speaking in English, even when you temporarily run out of new content to describe. Phrases such as "let me think about that for a moment," "another thing I notice is," and to add to that, all serve the practical purpose of keeping your mouth moving in English and your mind actively searching for more content, rather than falling into silence, which, as we discussed, tends to reinforce rather than reduce the freeze reflex over time. Another common troubleshooting scenario involves the graduated conversational exposure component. Specifically, the challenge many learners face in finding appropriate opportunities for real-time spoken interaction, particularly if they do not currently have regular access to native English speakers or fluent conversation partners in their daily life. I want to offer several practical alternatives here that still meaningfully engage the specific pathways this component is designed to strengthen. One option involves recording short, unscripted voice messages to yourself, responding to a randomly chosen question or topic, and then listening back to your own recording, not primarily to judge yourself harshly, but simply to notice specific moments of hesitation and specific words that felt difficult to retrieve, information that can then feed directly back into your targeted vocabulary activation for future sessions. Another option involves language exchange platforms, where you can find conversation partners who are native or fluent English speakers interested in practicing your native language in return, creating a mutually beneficial arrangement that provides genuine, real-time, spontaneous spoken interaction, often for free or at very low cost. A third option, particularly useful for learners who feel that even language exchange platforms feel too intimidating at their current stage, involves practicing spontaneous spoken responses to video prompts, pausing videos at natural question points, and responding out loud as though you were actually part of the conversation, before resuming the video to see how the actual speaker responded. While this is a slightly lower intensity form of exposure compared to live conversation with another real person, it still meaningfully engages spontaneous, real-time spoken production in a way that pure passive watching does not, and it can serve as a valuable intermediate step for learners who are not yet ready for live conversational exposure. I want to emphasize something important about all of these alternatives. None of them requires expensive lessons, formal classes, or ideal circumstances. The core principles behind this protocol, active retrieval, appropriate difficulty, and consistency, can be applied using freely available or very low-cost resources, provided you approach them with the specific mindset and structure we have outlined throughout this chapter, rather than falling back into purely passive, receptive habits simply because they feel more comfortable and familiar. Before we close, I want to bring together everything we have discussed throughout this video into a single, clear, unified message, because I want you to leave this video not just with information, but with a genuinely different relationship to your own English learning journey. You are not someone who lacks sufficient English knowledge. You are someone who has built an enormous, valuable foundation of passive English knowledge through years of reading, listening, and studying, and who has simply not yet had the opportunity to build the specific, distinct skill of active spoken retrieval, the skill that converts that passive knowledge into confident, real-time, spoken fluency. The freeze reflex you may have experienced is not evidence of weakness or inadequate ability. It is an ancient, well-intentioned protective mechanism, responding to the social risk of evaluated speech that can be gradually recalibrated through consistent, graduated, manageable exposure to spoken practice. The translation trap you may have relied on is not a permanent limitation. It is simply the natural result of a practice history heavily weighted toward reading and listening, and it can be gradually replaced with direct, translation-free connections between English words and their meanings, through deliberate, varied, meaning-focused spoken practice. The silence habit you may have developed is not a personal failing. It is the predictable outcome of an educational system, and often a self-study pattern, that trains silent reception far more frequently than active spoken production, and it can be deliberately rebalanced through consistent, daily, active retrieval practice. And underlying all of this, your brain remains genuinely capable of meaningful change, at any age, through the well-established principles of neuroplasticity, provided that your practice specifically targets the skill you want to improve, occurs at an appropriately challenging level of difficulty, and happens consistently over time. The path from where you are right now, understanding far more English than you can currently speak, toward where you want to be, speaking English with the same effortless confidence with which you already understand it, is not a mysterious, uncertain path. It is a specific, well-understood process, grounded in real principles of memory, learning, and neuroscience, and it begins with the small, consistent, daily practice of actively retrieving and producing the English that is already, right now, sitting inside your mind, waiting for the path between understanding and speaking to be built. That path is built one retrieval attempt at a time, one spoken sentence at a time, one slightly uncomfortable, slightly effortful, genuinely valuable practice session at a time. Not through more input, not through more passive study. Through the specific, deliberate act of speaking, out loud, consistently, starting today. I want to leave you with one last, very specific image before we close, because I think it captures everything we have covered more clearly than any summary could. Picture yourself a few months from now, sitting across from someone, maybe a colleague, maybe a stranger, maybe someone you have wanted to speak comfortably with for a long time. They ask you a question, an ordinary, unplanned, everyday question, exactly the kind that used to make your mind go quiet. Picture yourself answering, not perfectly, not without the occasional pause or imperfect word choice, but smoothly enough, directly enough, that the conversation simply continues, the way conversations are supposed to continue. Picture the small, quiet relief of that moment, the sense of a door finally opening that used to feel locked. That version of you is not a fantasy. It is not a different person with different knowledge than you have right now. It is the same vocabulary, the same grammar, the same years of absorbed English you already carry, simply given a practiced, well-worn path to your mouth. Every principle in this video points toward that same door, and every day of consistent, honest, sometimes uncomfortable practice is a step closer to opening it. You do not need to feel fully ready to begin. You do not need every piece of vocabulary perfected, every grammar rule mastered, every ounce of anxiety resolved before your first genuine attempt at retrieval practice today. Readiness, in the way most people imagine it, waiting until speaking feels easy before they start speaking, is precisely the trap that kept the door closed for so long. The people who eventually walk through that door are not the ones who waited until it felt comfortable. They are the ones who kept placing their hand on it, awkwardly, imperfectly, consistently, until one day it simply opened. Let today be one of those days. Choose one small piece of what we have discussed, a single warm-up question, a single target word, a single 30-second description, and say it out loud, right now, in your own voice, before you close this video. Not because one attempt will transform your fluency overnight, but because that single attempt is the first repetition of a pathway that, with enough consistency, will eventually feel as automatic and effortless as the language you were born speaking. This is the speaking reset. The reset is not about becoming a different person or acquiring some entirely new set of knowledge you currently lack. The reset is about finally building the bridge between the English you already possess and the voice that has been waiting all this time to finally use it.